Welcome to Shattered Skies Stories. Please hit the like button and the subscribe button so you don't miss any sci-fi stories. Also put in the comments where you are listening in from. Now, sit back and relax. The first symptom was always the same, a single drop of blood, pure crimson against alabaster skin, falling from a nostril as perfect as carved marble. Dr. Eris Thorne watched his daughter Lyra press a silk handkerchief to her nose, her movements graceful even in distress, and felt the ordered universe he had spent 30 years constructing begin to crumble. "It's nothing, Father," she whispered, her voice carrying the musical cadence that marked the genetically enhanced. But Eris knew better. He had seen this before, in the sterile reports that crossed his desk quarterly, reports of the pure succumbing to degradation syndrome, their perfect genes turning against them like a snake consuming its own tail. The irony wasn't lost on him. He, the architect of genetic perfection, the man who had eliminated disease and disorder from the upper reaches of the spire, now watched his greatest creation, his own daughter, begin to unravel at the cellular level. And somewhere, in the toxic depths below, the answer waited among the very people his work had condemned. The morning ritual never varied. Dr. Eris Thorne rose at precisely 6:30 a.m. in his apartment on the 847th floor of the central spire, performed his daily genetic optimization sequence, a cocktail of enhancers that maintained his cellular integrity, and reviewed the overnight reports from his bioengineering laboratories. Through his floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretched endlessly below, a vertical metropolis that disappeared into poisonous brown fog somewhere around the 200th floor. He rarely looked down. Today's reports were encouraging. The new strain of aerial kelp had shown a 15% improvement in oxygen production, and the latest generation of purification trees continued to exceed projections. Each success reinforced what Eris had always believed, that perfection was achievable through careful design and absolute control. Dr. Thorne? His assistant, Marcus, materialized beside him with the fluid grace of the genetically optimized. "The Council is requesting your presence for the monthly purity assessment." Eris nodded, straightening his pristine white coat. The purity assessment was both ceremony and necessity, a public reminder of the natural order that kept their society functioning. As chief bioengineer of the upper spire, his attendance was mandatory. The council chamber occupied the entire 900th floor, its crystalline walls offering a panoramic view of their domain. Below them, the spire's level stretched like a vast pyramid, each tier more polluted and chaotic than the last. The lowest levels, somewhere in that brown haze, were home to the naturals, those whose genetics had been deemed too flawed for enhancement, too dangerous for the upper reaches. "Citizens of the spire," announced Council Chairman Voss, his voice amplified through bioacoustic panels that his own laboratories had perfected. "Today we celebrate another month of genetic purity, another step away from the chaos that once plagued humanity." The assembled crowd, all bearing the telltale signs of optimization, symmetrical features, enhanced musculature, luminous skin, applauded with synchronized precision. Eris found himself studying their faces, noting the subtle variations he had programmed into their genetic templates. No two were identical, but all shared the same fundamental improvements he had pioneered decades ago. "Dr. Thorne," Chairman Voss continued, "would you honor us with this month's progress report?" Eris stepped forward, activating the holographic display with a gesture. Complex genetic sequences bloomed in the air around him, three-dimensional representations of life itself bent to his will. "The fourth generation of atmospheric processors has exceeded all projections," he began, his voice carrying the authority of absolute expertise. "Air quality in levels 800 through 950 has improved by another 3.2%, while our enhanced flora continues to expand its range throughout the upper spire." He paused at a particularly elegant gene sequence, one that had taken him months to perfect. "Most significantly, we've achieved a breakthrough in longevity enhancement. The new cellular repair protocols should extend optimized human lifespans by an additional 40 years. The applause was thunderous, but Eris barely heard it. His mind was already moving to the next challenge, the next improvement, the next step toward absolute perfection. This was his life's work, the systematic elimination of human frailty, the creation of a society where disease, aging, and genetic disorder were merely historical curiosities. Yet as he looked out at the sea of perfect faces, a familiar unease stirred in his chest. It was a feeling he'd learned to suppress over the years, a nagging sense that something fundamental was missing from their paradise. The feeling intensified whenever he thought about the lower levels, about the naturals living in squalor and chaos while he and his peers enjoyed the fruits of genetic perfection. But such thoughts were counterproductive. The system worked because it was stratified, because each level served its purpose. The naturals provided manual labor and raw materials, while the enhanced maintained order and progress. It was elegant, efficient, and above all, stable. After the ceremony, Eris returned to his laboratory, a sprawling complex of pristine white chambers filled with the humming machinery of genetic engineering. Here, surrounded by the tools of creation, he felt most at peace. The biotanks glowed with soft blue light, each containing some new improvement to humanity's design. Flowers that could survive in pure toxins, trees that converted radiation into harmless energy, insects that could break down the most stubborn pollutants. All children of his imagination made real through genetic manipulation. Father? He turned to find Lyra in the doorway, her presence immediately brightening the sterile space. At 19, she represented the pinnacle of his achievements, not just enhanced, but perfected. Her genetic template had been crafted with painstaking care, incorporating the best innovations from 30 years of research. She was beautiful, brilliant, and utterly pure. How was the assessment? She asked, moving with the unconscious grace that marked her generation. Successful, as always. He studied her face, noting the perfect symmetry of her features, the luminous quality of her skin that spoke of optimized cellular function. Your studies? Advanced genetic theory is fascinating, she said, genuine enthusiasm lighting her eyes. Professor Chen says I have an intuitive grasp of biomechanical systems. Perhaps I could assist in your research? The suggestion sent a warm glow through his chest. Lyra following in his footsteps, continuing his work, pushing the boundaries of perfection even further, it was everything he could have hoped for. We'll see, he said, but his smile revealed his true feelings. First, you must complete your basic education. Perfection requires patience. 3 weeks later, Lyra collapsed during her morning genetics lecture. Eris received the emergency alert through his neural implant while reviewing the latest batch of atmospheric processors. The message was brief but devastating, subject experiencing acute systemic failure. Genetic markers indicate degradation syndrome. Immediate intervention required, He found her in the medical bay, connected to a web of monitoring devices that painted her vital signs in holographic displays around the treatment pod. Dr. Sarah Chen, the Spire's foremost genetic physician, looked up as he approached, her expression grim. When did the symptoms begin? She asked without preamble. What symptoms? But even as he spoke, Eris was scanning the readouts, his trained eye interpreting the cascade of genetic markers that spelled out an impossible diagnosis. Lyra, Dr. Chen said gently, when did you first notice the nosebleeds? His daughter's eyes fluttered open, focusing on him with obvious effort. Last week, she whispered. But I thought. I hoped. Degradation syndrome. Eris felt the words echo through his mind like a death knell. The condition was rare but always fatal, affecting only those with the highest levels of genetic optimization. Their enhanced cells, pushed to the limits of biological perfection, eventually turned against themselves in a cascade of systemic failure. There must be an error, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting in his chest. Run the diagnostics again. I've run them 4 times, Dr. Chen replied. The genetic markers are unmistakable. Her enhancement sequences are breaking down at the cellular level. Eris stared at the holographic displays, watching his daughter's perfect genetics unravel in real time. This was impossible. He had spent years perfecting the enhancement protocols, had personally overseen Lyra's genetic template. There should be no flaws, no weaknesses for the syndrome to exploit. How long? He asked. 6 months, perhaps less. I'm sorry, Eris. The next hours passed in a blur of frantic research. Eris accessed every database, consulted every expert, reviewed every case study of degradation syndrome ever recorded. The pattern was always the same: the condition appeared without warning, progressed rapidly, and defied every attempt at treatment. The more genetically perfect the subject, the more virulent the syndrome became. But there had to be something. Some overlooked factor, some hidden variable that could be exploited. He was Dr. Eris Thorne, the man who had conquered genetic disease itself. He would not, could not, lose his daughter to an oversight in his own design. It was Marcus who brought him the file, arriving at his laboratory near midnight with obvious reluctance. "Sir," his assistant said, "I found something in the deep archives. A research project from the early days of the enhancement program." The file was stamped with classification codes Eris hadn't seen in decades, dating back to the initial colonization of the Spire. As he read, his world began to shift on its axis. "Project Genesis," he murmured, scanning the dense technical language. "A study of genetic adaptation in unmodified humans living in high-toxicity environments." The research had been conducted in the lower levels, among the naturals who scraped out their existence in the polluted depths of the Spire. The findings were remarkable, despite, or perhaps because of, their exposure to environmental toxins. The natural population showed an immunity to genetic degradation that was absent in the enhanced. "This is preliminary research," Eris said, but his mind was already racing through the implications. "The sample sizes are too small, the methodology questionable." "Sir," Marcus interrupted gently, "there's more. The project was terminated not because of scientific concerns, but by direct order of the Council. They deemed the research contrary to the fundamental principles of genetic purity." Eris stared at the classification stamp, "Terminated by order of Council Directive 847-A, all research materials to be sealed." The truth hit him like a physical blow. They had known. The Council, the very people he served, had known that the enhancement program carried this fatal flaw. They had chosen to suppress the research rather than risk questioning the foundation of their society. His hands trembling, Eris accessed the deepest levels of the archive system, using clearance codes he hadn't employed in years. What he found there shattered the last of his faith in the system he had helped create. Reports of degradation syndrome stretching back 20 years, each one carefully classified and buried. Hundreds of cases among the enhanced elite, all attributed to rare genetic anomalies or unprecedented cellular mutations. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it: the more genetically perfect a person became, the more likely they were to succumb to the syndrome. And in every case, the recommended treatment was the same: palliative care until death. No research into cures, no exploration of alternatives. Just acceptance of the inevitable price of perfection. But there was one notation that caught his attention, a single line buried in a supplemental report: anecdotal evidence suggests natural populations possess enzymatic pathways capable of cellular repair absent in enhanced subjects. Further research prohibited under Council Directive 847, Natural populations. The very people his work had condemned to the lower levels, living in squalor and breathing poisoned air, might hold the key to saving his daughter. Eris closed the file and walked to the observation window that looked out over the Spire's endless descent. Somewhere down there, beyond the brown haze of pollution, beyond the rigid barriers that separated the pure from the natural, lay answers that could save Lyra's life. For the first time in 30 years, Dr. Eris Thorne began to plan a journey to the world below. The transition between levels was more jarring than Eris had anticipated. At level 600, the walls still gleamed with bioluminescent panels and the air carried the crisp scent of purified atmosphere. By level 400, rust stains marred the metal surfaces and the ventilation systems wheezed with mechanical strain. At level 200, where the transport pods refused to descend further, the very air seemed thick with invisible toxins. Eris had never ventured below level 500 in his 30 years at the Spire. The lower reaches were the domain of maintenance crews and supply runners, enhanced individuals with specific genetic modifications that allowed them to function in the degraded environment for limited periods. Beyond level 100, only naturals could survive long-term exposure to the accumulated pollution and radiation. His modified clothing, a biosuit designed to filter toxins and regulate temperature, marked him immediately as an outsider. The few residents he encountered in the transition zone stared openly, their unenhanced features showing curiosity mixed with suspicion. Some bore the telltale signs of environmental adaptation: darker skin to resist radiation, enlarged lung capacity for processing thin air, eyes that glowed faintly in the perpetual twilight of the lower levels. The descent into the natural zones required a guide, and Eris had spent considerable resources acquiring the contact information for someone called Nyx. The name alone suggested someone comfortable operating outside official channels, which was exactly what he needed. He found her at level 150, in a market district that existed in the gap between worlds. Here, enhanced traders came to acquire rare materials and information that couldn't be obtained through official channels, while natural scavengers traded the debris of upper-level civilization for food and medicine. Nyx wasn't what he had expected. Where he had anticipated someone hardened by life in the depths, he found a young woman perhaps Lyra's age, her dark skin marked with intricate bioluminescent tattoos that pulsed with her heartbeat. Her clothing was a patchwork of scavenged materials, parts of environmental suits, strips of biofabric, metal plates that had been shaped into armor. But her eyes were sharp with intelligence, and when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that commanded immediate respect. "Dr. Eris Thorn," she said before he could introduce himself. "The Gene-Wright himself, come slumming in the depths. What brings the architect of our misery to the world he helped destroy?" The hostility in her voice was expected, but the accuracy of her knowledge was not. "You know who I am. Everyone down here knows who you are. You're the reason half the lower levels are uninhabitable. Your atmospheric processors filter the clean air up to the heights while we breathe the dregs." She gestured at the toxic haze that hung like a permanent fog around them. "Your enhanced plants suck the nutrients from the soil, leaving us with dust and poison. I need passage to the deepest levels," Eris said, ignoring the accusations even as they struck home. "I can pay." "Payment?" Nyx laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "What could you possibly offer that we need?" "Medicine," he said simply. "Genetic therapies. Treatment for radiation sickness, cellular regeneration protocols, immunity boosters designed specifically for natural populations." Her laughter died. "You're lying. I have a laboratory. I have resources. And I have a very good reason to help your people." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because she studied him with new interest. "What kind of reason?" "My daughter is dying of degradation syndrome. The research I found suggests that naturals possess immunity factors that could save her life." Degradation syndrome. Nyx's expression shifted from suspicion to something approaching satisfaction. The great genetic perfection eating itself from within. How poetic. "Will you help me or not?" She was quiet for a long moment, her bioluminescent tattoos pulsing in complex patterns that suggested deep thought. Finally, she nodded. "The journey to the deepest levels is dangerous. We'll need supplies, and you'll need to follow my orders without question. One mistake down there and we both die." "Agreed. Then welcome to the real world, Dr. Thorn." The preparation took 2 days. Nyx led him through a maze of black market suppliers, acquiring radiation detectors, emergency medical supplies, and most importantly, genetic modulators that would allow his enhanced physiology to function in the toxic environment of the depths. "These will keep your precious perfect genes from dissolving in the acid air," she explained as she programmed a series of injections. "But they'll also make you sick. Nausea, disorientation, cellular stress. Your body will think it's dying. How long will the effects last?" "Until we return to the clean levels. Assuming we return at all." As the modulators took effect, Eris felt his enhanced senses begin to dull. Colors became muted, his reaction time slowed, and a persistent nausea settled in his stomach. It was the first time in decades that he had experienced physical discomfort, and the sensation was both disturbing and oddly liberating. They began their descent at dawn, when the thermal currents from the depths were at their weakest. The transport system in the lower levels was a hodgepodge of scavenged machinery held together by ingenuity and desperation. Cable cars made from salvaged pods swayed through shafts carved directly into the spire's structure, while magnetic platforms rode rail systems that had been cobbled together from dozens of different technologies. The spire wasn't built, Nix explained as they rode a creaking platform deeper into the structure's heart. It was grown. Layer upon layer of habitation pods and industrial modules, all stacked on top of whatever came before. The lowest levels are from the original colony ships. That's where we're going. Level 50 was a revelation. Instead of the sterile corridors and geometric chambers of the upper reaches, here the architecture was organic, flowing. The walls curved in smooth arcs that suggested they had been shaped rather than built, and everything was covered in a thin layer of bioluminescent moss that provided the only light in the perpetual darkness. The first colonists were bioengineers too, Nick said, noting his fascination. But they worked with nature instead of trying to replace it. This moss? It's been growing for 200 years, filtering toxins from the air and providing light. Your atmospheric processors could learn something from it. The residents of level 50 were unlike anything Eris had encountered. Their adaptations were more extreme than those in the transition zones, skin that actually seemed to photosynthesize in the dim light, enlarged hearts and lungs that could process the thinnest air, and most remarkably, children who played happily in conditions that would kill an enhanced human within hours. How do they survive? He asked, watching a group of youngsters chase each other through puddles of what appeared to be industrial runoff. Evolution, Nix replied. 200 years of adapting to whatever toxins and radiation leak down from above. Their immune systems are incredible, they can process poisons that would liquefy your enhanced cells. It was exactly what the archived research had suggested, but seeing it firsthand was still shocking. These people, whom the Council classified as genetically inferior, had achieved something his decades of careful engineering had failed to accomplish: true resilience. Their first major setback came at level 30. The platform they were riding jerked to a halt as warning lights began flashing throughout the transport shaft. Below them, Eris could see figures moving with military precision, enhanced individuals in full environmental suits, carrying weapons that hummed with bioelectric energy. Council enforcement, Nix whispered, her face grim. Someone reported our descent. How is that possible? Your genetic signature is being tracked. Every enhanced individual has biomarkers that can be detected by Council sensors. She was already moving, pulling emergency supplies from hidden compartments in the platform. They know exactly where you are. The enforcement team was closing fast, using powered ascenders to climb the transport shaft. Eris could see their leader now, a figure in pristine white armor whose movements carried the deadly grace of military enhancement. There's an emergency exit at level 25, Nick said, clipping a rappelling line to the platform's edge. We rappel down the maintenance shaft and hope they don't follow. Hope? The shaft leads directly into the reactor core's cooling system. The radiation levels will kill them in minutes, even with their suits. What about us? Nix's smile was grim. Guess we'll find out how well those modulators work. The rappel into darkness was the longest few minutes of Eris's life. Behind them, he could hear the enforcement team reaching their abandoned platform, their voices echoing through the shaft as they discovered the emergency exit. Below, the maintenance shaft opened into a vast chamber filled with the humming machinery that kept the spire's lowest levels habitable. They landed in ankle-deep water that glowed with a faint radioactive phosphorescence. The Geiger counter on Eris's belt immediately began clicking rapidly, indicating radiation levels that would have been fatal to an unmodified human. Welcome to the reactor core, Nick said, shouldering her pack. The heart of the spire, and the source of all the poison that rains down on my people. But they had escaped the enforcement team, and more importantly, they were now only a few levels away from their destination. The deepest inhabited zones of the spire, where the descendants of the original colonists had maintained their ancient knowledge and, perhaps, the key to saving Lyra's life. The colony ship's original biolaboratories occupied level 15, buried so deep in the spire's foundations that few people remembered they existed. Here, in chambers that had been sealed for over a century, Dr. Elena Vasquez maintained the genetic archives of humanity's first generation of interstellar colonists. Nix had known Dr. Vasquez since childhood, one of the few people from the depths who had maintained contact with the reclusive scientist. When they entered her domain, a sprawling complex of ancient biotanks and primitive genetic sequencers, the elderly woman looked up from her work with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. "Nix, child," she said, her voice carrying a faint accent that spoke of origins far from the spire. "And Dr. Eris Thorne. I wondered when you would finally make this journey. You know why I'm here?" Eris asked. "Your daughter's condition, yes. Degradation syndrome has been claiming the enhanced for 20 years. I've been waiting for one of you to finally seek answers instead of simply accepting death as the price of perfection." The laboratory was a museum of humanity's genetic past. Along the walls, preservation tanks held samples from Earth's biosphere, plants and animals that had been extinct for generations, their genetic codes maintained in perfect stasis. But it was the central chamber that caught Eris's attention, a massive biotank that glowed with soft blue light. "The Genesis Archive," Dr. Vasquez explained, following his gaze. "Complete genetic records of the original colonist population, before any enhancements or modifications. The baseline human genome in all its chaotic, imperfect glory." Eris approached the tank with reverence. Inside, suspended in biogel, were thousands of genetic samples, the raw material from which both enhanced and natural populations had emerged. "Show me," he said. What Dr. Vasquez revealed over the next hours changed everything Eris thought he knew about genetics, evolution, and the nature of perfection itself. The original colonists had carried within their genes a remarkable diversity. Not just in appearance or abilities, but in fundamental cellular repair mechanisms. Some possessed enzymes that could break down toxins, others had redundant organ systems that provided backup functionality, still others carried dormant genes that could be activated in response to environmental stress. "We called it genetic resilience," Dr. Vasquez explained, manipulating holographic displays that showed the intricate dance of DNA sequences. The ability to adapt, to survive, to thrive in conditions that would destroy a more specialized organism. But the enhancement program eliminated most of these factors, Eris said, studying the data with growing horror. "We selected for specific traits and discarded the rest as junk genes." "Exactly. You created beautiful, perfect, fragile creatures. Like orchids in a greenhouse, stunning to behold, but utterly dependent on controlled conditions for survival." The comparison stung because it was accurate. Every enhanced human, including his own daughter, was the product of careful genetic selection that had prioritized certain traits while eliminating others. They had traded adaptability for perfection, resilience for beauty. The naturals retained these repair mechanisms? Not all of them, but enough. 200 years of exposure to environmental toxins has activated dormant genetic pathways, forced evolutionary adaptations that your enhanced population cannot access. Dr. Vasquez called up another display, this one showing cellular samples from natural populations. The genetic patterns were chaotic compared to the elegant symmetry of enhanced genes, but within that chaos was something remarkable: cells that could repair themselves from almost any damage, immune systems that could adapt to new toxins within hours, enzymatic pathways that could break down pollutants and convert them to useful energy. "This is what your daughter needs," Dr. Vasquez said. "Not treatment of her symptoms, but restoration of the genetic pathways that could repair the damage your enhancements have caused." Is such treatment possible? Theoretically, yes. But it would require fundamental changes to her genetic structure. She would no longer be enhanced in the traditional sense. The implications were staggering. To save Lyra's life, he would have to undo decades of genetic perfection, restore the very flaws that the enhancement program had been designed to eliminate. She would lose her perfect symmetry, her luminous skin, her enhanced cognitive abilities. She would become, by the Spire's standards, natural. There's something else, Dr. Vasquez continued, her expression growing grave. The treatment protocol would need to be administered here, in the deep levels. The process requires exposure to the same environmental factors that activated these pathways in the natural population. How long? Months, perhaps a year. And there's no guarantee of success. The genetic reversion process is complex and dangerous. Many subjects would not survive. Eris felt the weight of the impossible choice settling on his shoulders. Return to the upper levels with this knowledge and watch his daughter die, or bring her to this toxic environment and risk killing her in the attempt to save her life. But before he could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the laboratory complex. Council enforcement, Nick said, checking her communication devices. They've found the reactor core access points. Full military squad, heavy weapons, genetic tracking equipment. Through the laboratory's ancient monitoring systems, they could see the enforcement team spreading through the lower levels like a plague. The leader, whom Eris now recognized as Colonel Marcus Vance of the Genetic Purity Division, was coordinating a systematic search of every chamber and corridor. They're not just looking for me, Eris realized. They're sterilizing the entire deep-level population. Dr. Vasquez moved with surprising speed for someone her age, activating security protocols that sealed the laboratory's entrances. They've done this before. Every few years, when too many naturals begin showing signs of genetic advancement, the Council orders a cleansing. They claim it's necessary to prevent contamination of the upper levels. Contamination? Nix's voice was bitter with rage. We're the contamination? We're the ones living in the toxic waste of their perfect society. But Eris was studying the tactical displays, his enhanced mind automatically analyzing the enforcement team's movement patterns. They're herding the population toward the thermal processing plants. They intend to eliminate everyone in the deep levels. The scope of the Council's plan was breathtaking in its brutality. Rather than risk the possibility that natural populations might develop genetic advantages that could challenge the enhancement paradigm, they were prepared to commit genocide on a massive scale. We have to stop them, he said. With what? Nix demanded. They have military enhancements, powered weapons, environmental suits that let them operate anywhere in the Spire. We have broken equipment and good intentions. But Dr. Vasquez was smiling, an expression that held decades of carefully contained fury. They may have forgotten, but this laboratory was designed by the original colonists. People who understood that knowledge itself is the most dangerous weapon. She led them to a sealed chamber that Eris hadn't noticed before, its entrance hidden behind banks of genetic storage tanks. Inside, the walls were lined with data cores that hummed with barely contained energy. The Genesis archive isn't just genetic samples, she explained. It's complete records of everything: atmospheric composition, biological systems, technological specifications, and most importantly, the control codes for every system in the Spire. Eris stared at the data cores with growing understanding. You have access to the Spire's infrastructure? The Enhanced took control of the upper levels, but they never bothered to secure the deep systems. Why would they? Who would think that the genetically inferior naturals could pose a threat to their perfect society? The irony was perfect. The Council's own arrogance had left them vulnerable to the very people they sought to eliminate. And now, with Lyra's life hanging in the balance and genocide unfolding in the depths, Eris found himself faced with a choice that would define not just his own future, but the future of every person in the Spire. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, terrible in its implications. Dr. Vasquez had spent decades mapping the Spire's biological and technological systems, understanding how the enhanced society's perfection depended on a delicate balance of atmospheric processors, genetic monitoring networks, and environmental controls. The same systems that Eris had helped design could be turned against the very people they were meant to serve. The enhanced population is completely dependent on their controlled environment, Dr. Vasquez explained as she interfaced with the Genesis Archive's control systems. Their genetic modifications make them incredibly sensitive to atmospheric changes, radiation fluctuations, even minor variations in air pressure. You're talking about biological warfare, Eris said, the implications churning in his stomach. I'm talking about survival, Nyx replied sharply. They're literally trying to exterminate us. Every natural in the deep levels will be dead within 6 hours if we don't act. Through the laboratory's monitoring systems, they could watch the enforcement operation unfolding. Colonel Vance's teams were moving with ruthless efficiency, sealing access points and herding natural populations toward the thermal processing centers. The death toll was already mounting, and with each passing minute, more families were being destroyed. The atmospheric processors, Dr. Vasquez continued, can be modified to introduce genetic destabilization agents into the upper levels. Nothing immediately fatal, but enough to disrupt the enhancement program's genetic locks. That would affect everyone, Eris protested. My daughter, Marcus, every enhanced person in the spire. Your daughter is already dying, Nyx said bluntly. And your assistant chose his side when he reported your descent to the enforcement teams. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Marcus, whom he had trusted for years, had betrayed him to protect the system that granted him privilege. The personal betrayal hurt almost as much as the tactical implications. Even if we succeed in disrupting the atmospheric systems, Eris said, the enhanced population will panic. There could be civil war, complete social collapse. Better than genocide, Dr. Vasquez replied. And perhaps, in the chaos that follows, both populations can learn to coexist instead of this rigid hierarchy that benefits no one. The counterattack would require precise timing. Dr. Vasquez would use the Genesis Archive's access codes to override the atmospheric processors, while Nyx coordinated the natural populations to take control of critical infrastructure points throughout the spire. Meanwhile, Eris would need to return to the upper levels to retrieve Lyra and guide her to the deep laboratories where the genetic reversion treatment waited. The atmospheric disruption will begin in 2 hours, Dr. Vasquez said, her fingers dancing across control surfaces that hummed with barely contained power. That gives you enough time to reach your daughter and return before the upper levels become uninhabitable for enhanced individuals. And if I'm caught? Then Lyra dies anyway, Nyx said with characteristic bluntness. At least this way, she has a chance. As Eris prepared for the dangerous journey back through the spire's vertical maze, Dr. Vasquez called him aside for a final conversation. There's something you need to understand, she said quietly. The genetic reversion process isn't just medical treatment. It's transformation on the most fundamental level. Your daughter won't just look different, she'll think differently, feel differently, be different in ways you cannot imagine. Will she still be Lyra? She'll be who she was meant to be, before your enhancements shaped her into something else. Whether that person is still recognizable to you, that's a question only a father can answer. The words followed him as he began the ascent, using maintenance shafts and emergency passages to avoid the enforcement team still sweeping through the middle levels. Each floor upward brought back the familiar sensations of his enhanced physiology, sharper senses, increased strength, the subtle euphoria of genetic optimization. But now these feelings were tainted by knowledge of their cost. He reached his apartment at level 847 as the first phase of Dr. Vasquez's plan activated far below. Through his windows, he could see subtle changes in the atmospheric processor's output, slight variations in color and density that spoke of fundamental alterations to the air itself. Lyra was in the medical bay, her condition visibly worse than when he had left. The monitors around her treatment pod painted an increasingly desperate picture of systemic failure, genetic breakdown cascading through every organ system. Father? Her voice was barely a whisper. You came back. I found a treatment, he said, beginning to disconnect her from the monitoring equipment. But we have to leave immediately. Leave? Confusion flickered across her perfect features. Father, I can barely walk. The treatment isn't here. It's in the deep levels, among the naturals. He helped her into a mobile support suit, trying to ignore how fragile she felt in his arms. There are people there who understand genetics in ways we never imagined. As they moved through the corridors toward the emergency transport systems, Eris could see the first signs of atmospheric disruption affecting the enhanced population. Residents moved with less than their usual grace, some showing signs of disorientation as their finely tuned biology responded to the changing air composition. Emergency alarms began sounding as they reached the transport hub. Throughout the spire, genetic monitoring systems were detecting the atmospheric anomalies and triggering automatic containment protocols. Dr. Thorne. The voice cracked like a whip across the transport platform. Colonel Vance strode toward them, flanked by enforcement officers whose weapons were already powered and ready. Step away from the transport and surrender yourself for questioning. My daughter needs medical attention, Eris replied, helping Lyra toward the nearest descent pod. Your daughter is a victim of your own genetic engineering, Vance said coldly. As are we all. But your recent activities in the lower levels have compromised the integrity of our entire society. Compromised how? By discovering that our perfect genetics are fundamentally flawed? By learning that the people we've oppressed for centuries hold the keys to real genetic resilience? Vance's enhanced features showed no emotion, but his weapons targeting system had locked onto Eris's chest. You've been exposed to natural contamination. Your genetic purity has been compromised. Standard protocol requires immediate sterilization. Sterilization. The word tasted like poison in Eris's mouth. You mean execution. I mean preservation of genetic integrity for the greater good. But even as they spoke, the atmospheric disruption was intensifying. Around them, enhanced individuals were beginning to show more serious symptoms: nausea, disorientation, cellular stress responses that their modified biology couldn't handle. Your atmospheric processors are failing, Vance observed, speaking into his communication device. Initiate emergency air filtration protocols on all levels above 500. It's too late for that, Eris said, settling Lyra into the transport pod. The Genesis archive has override codes that predate your enhancement protocols. Every system in the spire is compromised. For the first time, he saw uncertainty flicker across the colonel's face. The descent pod plunged into chaos. Throughout the spire, Dr. Vasquez's atmospheric disruption was causing systemic failures in the enhancement program's biological supports. On level 800, residents stumbled through corridors as their modified balance organs struggled with altered air pressure. On level 700, the bioluminescent panels that provided light began flickering as their enhanced organisms reacted to genetic destabilization agents. But it was at level 500 where the real crisis began. The atmospheric processors that Eris had spent decades perfecting were designed to maintain precise environmental conditions for enhanced physiology. As Dr. Vasquez's override codes forced them to introduce natural adaptation factors into the air supply, the processors began shutting down in cascade failures. Emergency containment breach on levels 600 through 950, came the announcement through the spire's communication systems. All enhanced personnel report to genetic stabilization centers immediately. But the genetic stabilization centers were themselves failing, their equipment calibrated for the old atmospheric conditions. Throughout the upper levels, the enhanced population faced a terrible choice. Remain in their failing paradise and risk cellular breakdown, or venture into the toxic lower levels where their genetics couldn't survive. Eris watched the crisis unfold through the pod's communication systems as they descended past level 400. Part of him felt satisfaction at seeing the system's vulnerabilities exposed, but a larger part recognized the human cost of what they had unleashed. Father, Lyra whispered, what's happening? Revolution, he said simply. The end of one world and the beginning of another. They reached level 50 as the first enhanced refugees began arriving at the transition zones. These were individuals who had chosen to risk the toxic environment rather than wait for death in their sterile chambers. Most would not survive the journey, but some, those with genetic templates that retain trace elements of natural resilience, might adapt. Nyx met them at the transport platform, her bioluminescent tattoos pulsing with urgent information. The enforcement teams are retreating to the upper levels, she reported. The atmospheric disruption is affecting their equipment as much as their biology. What about the deep-level populations? Safe, for now. Dr. Vasquez has activated every defense system the Genesis archive contains. The natural communities are securing the infrastructure that keeps the whole spire running. They moved quickly through the organic corridors of level 50, past families of naturals who watched the unfolding crisis with mixtures of fear and hope. These people had suffered under enhanced oppression for generations, but they were also witnessing the potential collapse of the only civilization they had ever known. The treatment facility is ready, Nix continued as they approached the ancient biolaboratories. But Dr. Vasquez wants to speak with you before we begin. They found the elderly scientist in the Genesis Archive central chamber, surrounded by holographic displays that showed the spire's systems in real time. The atmospheric processors were failing faster than even she had anticipated, and the cascade effects were spreading throughout the vertical city. The enhanced population is more fragile than we calculated, she reported grimly. The atmospheric disruption is causing cellular breakdown at an accelerated rate. We have perhaps 6 hours before the upper levels become completely uninhabitable. Can the process be reversed? Eris asked. Partially. But only if we can establish a new equilibrium between enhanced and natural populations. The spire's ecosystem needs both genetic pools to maintain stability. She turned to Lyra, who was now barely conscious despite the mobile support suit's medical systems. The genetic reversion process will take weeks to complete. During that time, the atmospheric conditions throughout the spire will be chaotic. Many enhanced individuals will not survive. Including my daughter? That depends on how much of her original genetic potential we can restore. The reversion process is essentially controlled genetic breakdown. We're hoping her body can rebuild itself using pathways that the enhancement program suppressed. The treatment chamber was unlike anything in the upper levels medical facilities. Instead of sterile white surfaces and mechanical precision, here everything was organic, flowing. The biotank at the chamber's center seemed grown rather than built, its surfaces covered in the same bioluminescent moss that provided light throughout the deep levels. The moss contains enzymes that can break down enhancement program genetic locks, Dr. Vasquez explained as they prepared Lyra for insertion into the tank. It's been evolving for 2 centuries, adapting to process the genetic toxins that leak down from the upper levels. As Lyra was lowered into the biotank, her perfect features already beginning to shift as the reversion process began, Eris felt the weight of everything he had lost and everything he might yet save. But their moment of hope was shattered by the sound of weapons fire echoing through the laboratory complex. Enforcement teams, Nix reported, checking her tactical displays. Colonel Vance has brought a full military unit into the deep levels. They're fighting their way toward the Genesis archive. Through the ancient monitoring systems, they could see the battle unfolding. Enhanced soldiers in full environmental suits battled against natural defenders who used their knowledge of the spire's organic architecture to devastating advantage. But the military units had superior weapons and training, and they were advancing steadily toward the heart of the deep levels. They're going to destroy the archive, Dr. Vasquez said with grim certainty. Vance knows that we control the spire's infrastructure from here. If he can eliminate the Genesis archive, he can restore enhanced control over the atmospheric systems. Even if it kills half the enhanced population in the process. Better to rule over ruins than lose control entirely. Eris looked at his daughter, now suspended in the biotank as ancient genetic pathways slowly awakened in her cells. The reversion process had barely begun, but already he could see subtle changes, her skin losing some of its artificial luminescence, her features becoming slightly less symmetrical but somehow more alive. How long until the treatment is irreversible? He asked. Another hour, perhaps 2. The weapon's fire was getting closer. Through the laboratory's organic walls, they could hear the distinctive hum of military-grade bioweapons cutting through the natural defenses. I have to stop them, Eris said. With what? Nix demanded. You're one enhanced individual with no weapons and no military training. I have something better, he replied, accessing the Genesis archive's control systems. I have complete knowledge of every system Vance is depending on to keep his soldiers alive down here. The plan was desperate, but it was the only option remaining. While Dr. Vasquez and Nix defended the treatment chamber, Eris would use his access to the Spire's infrastructure to turn the deep levels themselves into a weapon. Their environmental suits depend on atmospheric processors to filter the toxic air, he explained as his fingers flew across the archive's interfaces. But those processors are still connected to my original control networks. If I can modify their filtration algorithms. You're talking about poisoning them with their own equipment, Nick said. I'm talking about giving them the same choice we've had for generations, adapt or die. The atmospheric processors throughout the deep levels responded to his commands with mechanical precision. Within minutes, the air that Colonel Vance's soldiers were breathing began to change, filled with the same genetic adaptation factors that had shaped natural evolution for centuries. For enhanced individuals, exposure to these factors was catastrophic. Their specialized genetics, designed for perfection rather than adaptability, began breaking down almost immediately. Through the monitoring systems, Eris watched the enforcement teams falter as their own biology turned against them. Soldiers who had seemed invincible moments before collapsed as cellular breakdown cascaded through their enhanced systems. But Colonel Vance himself was different. His military modifications included emergency genetic stabilization protocols, and he continued advancing toward the Genesis archive even as his soldiers fell around him. The laboratory's entrance exploded inward as Vance's bioweapon carved through the organic barriers. The colonel strode into the chamber like an avenging angel, his powered armor gleaming white against the soft luminescence of the moss-covered walls. "Dr. Eris Thorne," he said, his voice amplified by his suit's communication systems. "By the authority of the Genetic Purity Council, you are charged with crimes against humanity. Surrender immediately or face immediate execution." Humanity? Eris stepped between the colonel and his daughter's treatment chamber. "You mean the tiny fraction of humanity that your council deems genetically worthy?" "I mean civilization itself. Order. Progress. The systematic improvement of the human condition through controlled genetic enhancement. Built on the oppression and murder of anyone who doesn't fit your narrow definition of perfection." Vance's weapon powered up, its bioelectric field crackling with lethal energy. "Your daughter's condition is proof of the enhancement program's flaws. Rather than accept those flaws and work to correct them, you've chosen to destroy everything we've built. I've chosen to save my daughter's life. Everything else is simply the consequence of that choice. Then you've chosen poorly." The bioweapon's discharge lit up the chamber like captured lightning, but the beam never reached its target. Dr. Vasquez had stepped between them, her frail body absorbing the full force of the colonel's attack. "Elena!" Nix's cry echoed through the chamber as the elderly scientist collapsed, her body already beginning the cellular breakdown that marked fatal bioweapon exposure. "The archive," Dr. Vasquez whispered with her last breath. "Protect the archive." Her death triggered something profound in the Genesis archive systems. As her hand fell away from the central control interface, genetic locks that had been in place for 2 centuries suddenly released. Throughout the Spire, ancient systems awakened, not just atmospheric processors and environmental controls, but the deep biological networks that had originally grown the vertical city itself. The Spire began to change. Walls that had been rigid metal and plastic for generations started to soften, becoming more organic. The harsh artificial lighting of the upper levels gave way to the gentle bioluminescence that the original colonists had preferred. Most importantly, the atmospheric systems began finding a new equilibrium, not the sterile perfection that enhanced genetics required, nor the toxic chaos that had driven natural evolution, but something balanced between them. Colonel Vance fired again, but his weapon was failing as the changing atmosphere affected its bioelectric systems. Around him, the laboratory itself was responding to the genetic disruption, moss-covered walls beginning to close around his position. "This is impossible," he said, his voice losing its mechanical amplification as his suit's systems failed. "Genetics don't work this way. Biology doesn't work this way." "Your biology doesn't work this way," Eris replied. "But life itself? Life finds a way to adapt, to survive, to thrive even in conditions that would destroy your perfect designs. The Colonel's armor was dissolving as the Archive's defenses recognized him as a threat to the genetic diversity the system was programmed to protect. Beneath the failing technology, Vance's enhanced features were already showing signs of cellular breakdown. "You've killed us all," he whispered as the organic walls embraced him. "Enhanced, natural, everyone in the spire. The systems can't maintain stability without controlled genetic parameters." "Then we'll learn new parameters," Eris said. Together. 6 months later, Eris stood on what had once been the observation deck of level 900, watching his daughter tend to a garden that grew impossibly in the open air. Lyra had survived the genetic reversion process, but Dr. Vasquez had been right about the fundamental changes it would bring. The young woman who emerged from the biotank bore little resemblance to the genetically perfect enhanced individual who had entered it. Her features were asymmetrical but alive with character, her skin showed the slight mottling that marked successful natural adaptation, and her movements carried an unconscious grace that spoke of harmony with her environment rather than genetic optimization. More importantly, she was healthy. The degradation syndrome that had been killing her was gone, replaced by the robust immune system and adaptable genetics of the natural population. She would never again be vulnerable to the cellular breakdown that claimed so many enhanced individuals. The spire itself had changed almost beyond recognition. The rigid hierarchy of levels had given way to a more organic organization, with former enhanced and natural populations mixing freely as the atmospheric systems maintained conditions suitable for both genetic pools. The vertical city was still vast, still home to millions of people, but it was no longer a monument to genetic apartheid. "The integration isn't complete," Nyx reported, joining him on the observation platform. She now served as coordinator between the former enhanced government and the natural communities, helping to establish new systems of governance that didn't depend on genetic classification. There are still problems. Some enhanced populations in the remote levels refuse to accept atmospheric modifications. Some natural communities want complete genetic reversion for all former enhanced individuals. And the resource distribution networks are still chaotic. "But it's working?" Eris asked. "It's working. Slowly, with many setbacks, but it's working." Below them, the city stretched into the distance, its levels no longer hidden by toxic fog but visible in all their organic complexity. Gardens and workshops, schools and laboratories, all mixed together in patterns that would have seemed impossible under the old system. "Any word from the other spires?" Nyx nodded grimly. 3 have accepted our model and begun their own integration processes. 2 have sealed their borders and declared us genetically contaminated. 1. She paused. 1 apparently chose complete genetic purification. There are no longer any natural populations in Spire 7. The news was sobering but not unexpected. The revolution that had begun in their city was spreading throughout humanity's scattered colonies, but not every population was choosing integration over ideology. And the research? Dr. Chen has taken over the genetics program. She's working with natural bioengineers to develop what she calls adaptive enhancement, genetic modifications that improve human capabilities without sacrificing resilience. Nyx smiled. "Your daughter has volunteered as a test subject." "Of course she has." Lyra looked up from her garden as if sensing their conversation, waving at her father with soil-stained hands. The sight filled Eris with an emotion he couldn't quite name, not the pride he had once felt at her genetic perfection, but something deeper and more complex. "Do you regret it?" Nyx asked. "Everything we destroyed to save her?" Eris considered the question as he watched his daughter coax impossible blooms from plants that had learned to thrive in the changing atmosphere. "I regret that it took so long to see the truth," he said finally. "I regret that Dr. Vasquez died for my blindness, that so many people suffered for our arrogance, that we nearly destroyed both populations in our pursuit of impossible perfection." He paused, watching a group of children play in the garden below, some showing traces of enhanced genetics, others clearly natural, all of them healthy and happy in ways that transcended genetic classification. "But do I regret saving my daughter? Do I regret giving both our peoples the chance to choose their own evolution? Never. The sun was setting through the spire's transparent outer walls, casting long shadows across the organic architecture that had grown to replace the sterile corridors of the past. In the distance, other vertical cities stretched toward the horizon, each one making its own choice about the future of human genetics. There would be challenges ahead. The integration process was messy, complicated, sometimes violent. Some enhanced individuals would never accept their loss of genetic superiority, while some natural communities would never forgive centuries of oppression. Resource conflicts, territorial disputes, and ideological differences would continue to create friction between the populations. But for the first time in generations, humanity had a choice. Not between perfection and imperfection, not between purity and contamination, but between different visions of what human beings could become. As darkness fell over the spire, bioluminescent guides began to glow throughout the city, marking pathways that connected levels that had been separated for centuries. The light was soft, organic, alive, nothing like the harsh artificial illumination that had once defined the upper reaches. Eris made his way down to the garden where Lyra waited, ready to learn about the new world they had helped create together. Behind them, the Genesis archive hummed with quiet power, its ancient systems adapting and evolving just as the people of the Spire learned to do the same. The age of genetic perfection was over. The age of genetic choice had begun. And in that choice, imperfect and chaotic as it was, lay the seeds of a future that neither enhanced nor natural could have imagined alone.